The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kendall Trump with Grain Journal Magazine in Decatur, Illinois, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Impacts of the Transportation System on Soybeans, Corn, and Related Agricultural Products, presented by the National Grain and Feed Association. I want to go ahead and thank our sponsors, Central Life Sciences, CoBank, CTech Ag, Farm Credit Services of America, and Trinity Rail for their support in bringing you today's presentation. Today's presenters are David Ellis, Senior Research Scientist, Brianne Glover, Associate Research Scientist, and Max Steadman, Assistant Research Scientist with Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation today by using the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be addressing your questions during a Q&A session following the presentation. As a note, today's webinar is being recorded and it will be available on grainnet.com within 24 hours. It will also be distributed to all registrants the day following the presentation. At this time, David, can you please do a voice check?
Hello, everybody.
Thank you. And now, can you please show us your screen? There we go. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Dr. David Ellis.
Well, thank you very much, Kendall, and welcome everybody. Once again, my name is David Ellis, and I'm Senior Research Scientist here in the Infrastructure Investment Analysis Program at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. And also, as Kendall mentioned, Dr. Brianne Glover is here in College Station with me. And up in Dallas is Max Steadman. They will also be available to, you'll hear them probably during the course of this presentation. But again, I want to thank the folks at USDA and the Agricultural Marketing Service for their support of this project. We've had an opportunity and had the pleasure of working with them on a couple of different projects, and they have been great folks to work with, and we certainly appreciate their support of this type of research. One of the things that we do, that this program here at TTI does, is we like to try to kind of pride ourselves, if you will, on trying to go into complicated issues and then develop analytical tools that are of assistance to folks, and then ultimately take that information or that data and turn it into information in a way that the general public can understand. And that's kind of the heart of this project, is to look at transportation issues, particularly as they relate to soybeans, but other products as well, and to look at transportation cost and the impact of those transportation costs on what folks ultimately pay for products. They have, as you can imagine, being on the producer end of things, they can reduce your revenue. They increase prices, which makes you less competitive in international markets, and then ultimately cost the end consumer more. One thing we have to point out: this project was begun in 2019, early 2019, actually late 2018, if I'm not mistaken. If you think back over that time frame, there's been a lot of things that have happened since this project started, in terms of events that have occurred that change some of the numbers that are in this study, and that is certainly the case. I want to point out, however, that the model that we developed, it's developed in such a way that as new cost numbers are developed, and you'll see this a little bit later on in the presentation, as new costs are incurred, they can be substituted in the model, and it doesn't change the fundamental algorithms inside the model. So the results that the research that was done here, even though so much has changed in terms of world events, both policy related and natural events, et cetera, the the process that we went through and the results that we were able to get are still valid. So those are some of the fundamental issues. And I want to point out one other thing is that one of the reasons that the study was undertaken was to identify transportation costs in particular, but then also to be able to use this kind of tool that we developed here as a way to advocate for improvements to the transportation system by highlighting how important they are to you and to the end consumer. It's one of the things that we don't really think about when there are infrastructure improvements that have to be that need to be done. You know, policymakers always tend to look at only one half of the equation, and that is, okay, what does it cost? They don't tend to look at what's the benefit that's going to be derived from it, and what's the cost of doing nothing. And in fact, there are significant costs to doing nothing, to letting a system deteriorate, and those costs are ultimately borne by you as producers, and then also by end consumers here in the United States. So with that having been said, how was this done? Well, we looked at hourly transportation costs for all different modes, looking at coming out of the Midwest United States down through the Mississippi and out the Gulf region for truck and rail and barge traffic. And costs were applied there, as you see, to origin and destinations. And we particularly looked at the soybean distribution chain to the Gulf. We did that because that's where we could get good data on the soybean industry. That wasn't necessarily the case with corn. And so but what we're saying about soybeans is very much true about corn as well. It's just that we focused on soybeans because that's where the data was, and that's where we could do these kind of calculations. So we looked at those costs, hourly transportation costs for truck and rail and barge traffic. And then we looked at a base transportation cost, and then any kind of additional cost due to traffic congestion. And that particularly as it relates to truck traffic, but then also costs associated with scheduling and loading delays at each step of the process. And that turned out to be fairly significant as well. And then from that, we were able to develop a high and low estimate of total transportation costs per ton for both domestic and export markets. And again, depending upon what the final product is, from farm to end consumer, the particular route that a product takes can vary considerably, and as can the number of intermediate processes and stops that can occur. Each one of which has cost associated with it. So again, we looked at these, did these calculations based on base transportation costs, additional costs due to traffic congestion, and then costs associated with scheduling and loading delays at each particular step of the process. And again, we looked at soybeans and corn moving from Midwest U.S. to the Gulf Coast region. They can take multiple forms of transportation and multiple routes, if you will, all along the supply chain. From harvest, the product can be moved to storage or barge or rail elevators for transportation, directly to processing plants or directly to market. And a lot of these products, as I mentioned, have different stops along, different paths along the supply chain. You just think about biodiesel, going to have more intermediate steps than soy meal, for example. And there's a report written on this, and we'll talk about that in a minute, where you can look at these supply chains in a flow chart to get kind of an idea of what happens along this process, and we'll reference that report here in just a moment. And then we developed hourly transportation cost profiles for for these commodities and for different modes of transportation, truck, rail, and barge, in terms of average trip mileage, tons moved, wait times for these products across the United States, and then congestion delay time, which is an important element to this, was built off of research that's done here at TTI on an annual basis, where we calculate congestion costs for some 436 urban areas in the United States, plus or minus a few. And that's done on an annual basis where traffic congestion is measured. And so we're able to come up with an estimate based on where a product is coming from, what the congestion cost is likely to be associated with moving that product. And then we also got information from rail experts about rail delay and data from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for barge delay. And these cost estimates, these hourly cost estimates, were then applied to estimate the transportation cost for each project. And if you kind of look at what the study found, you find a lot of variation from the high and low averages of transportation costs per ton. And I want to call your attention to something there, because you're going to probably notice it and go, what the heck are these guys talking about? You see the very first line there, domestic soybeans. The high and the low is the same. Why the heck is that? Well, it's because basically for domestic soybeans, there is just one route. I talked about earlier about the different paths that these products can take, and that is true for products except basically soybeans in their raw state. Okay, and so there's little variation. Now that 580 per ton is an average, so there's variation within that $5.80, but that is the low average and the high average cost, and you see it varies there on a lot of these other products that can take different routes along these supply chains. And then so if you look at what the study found in terms of delay cost per ton, again, you see that there's, number one, fairly significant cost associated with delay in terms of moving these products per ton, and fairly significant variability in terms of the delay cost per ton. And again, these, if you think about it, this delay cost is cost, some of which can be avoided. If we have a better infrastructure system, a more efficient infrastructure system, we can take some of that delay away. And then when you talk about being able to do that, then it makes these products more competitive in an international market. And if you really kind of stop and think about how the United States competes, how you compete as a producer, you know, we're not going to compete, for example, based on labor costs, because our wages here are going to be higher than they are in some third world country halfway around the world. We don't want to compete on the basis of labor costs. You know, there's a lot of costs that you have to pay from an environmental perspective, a workplace safety perspective, that other places and other countries don't have to pay. And that makes it difficult. One of the ways that we have always competed in the United States and international markets has been through innovation and efficiency. And this efficiency finds itself in the transportation system in terms of being able to move products from point A to point B as quickly and as cheaply as possible. And when our transportation system ceases to be able to do that, then that takes away one of the potential competitive advantages that you have. And you know, that ends up costing jobs, income, which then in turn affects demand of secondary and tertiary products. So again, all of these on this particular deal, this is all cost per ton for product delay. Now, with that as background, we want to take you into the model itself. And Brianne here is going to operate this model, and we're going to show you what this model does and how you might be able to use it. So I want to call your attention up to the top right-hand side. You see download report, user's guide, glossary, and then there's some information about the model and TTI. We produced 2 different reports for the Agricultural Marketing Service of USDA, and you can download those reports. We'll also give you links at the very end of this presentation, but you can download the reports there, and then there is a user's guide up there that shows you how to use this model. And then, of course, a glossary for some of the terms, if there's, for some reason, terms you may not, abbreviations you may not be familiar with. So one of the things that this model does, it allows you to do some down and dirty analysis. Let's say, for example, there's a project, an infrastructure project, and you want to, that's, in this case, it's set up to be done, the analysis is set up to be done for the state of Illinois. But there's a pull down menu there where you can actually select any number of different states in the Midwest if you wanted to do it for that particular state. And then if you're talking about a rural area versus urban or suburban areas as the origin for or as to where the transportation improvement will be done. And then you can enter the cost of the transportation improvement, the year that construction is going to start, when it's going to be finished, the percent of trucks that are on that road. AADT is average annual daily traffic. And then the average speed before and after the project is done. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, where do I get all this information? Well, first of all, if it's a project that's being done by a state DOT, they have all of that information, okay? You can get truck percentages, you can get average speeds, all that kind of stuff. What this allows you to do is to take this project and say, okay, what kind of impact is it likely to have on our business? So then you can say, if you had 2 or 3 different projects under consideration, or if the state DOT did, or whoever perhaps it's an advocacy group or whatever, there are different alternatives, then you can do an analysis to figure out what's going to have the biggest impact on the agricultural sector in your area, so that you may be able to make some judgment about, this is where we need to put our support. This is where we need to try to convince the DOT to do this project versus that project, because this one is going to have a bigger bang for the buck in terms of our business than these other projects are going to have. And so you're able to put in those particular variables, and it takes all this background data that we've been talking about having developed, and then does basic calculations in terms of vehicle operating cost savings, business time and reliability cost savings. That is the amount of the reliability costs have to do with how well the facility will function on a daily basis, how much you need to plan contingency time in there, expecting delays, that sort of thing, as well as personal time and reliability cost savings. That has to do with the personal travel that occurs on that facility, safety benefits, freight time cost savings, environmental benefits, business output, et cetera. So it does all these calculations and then produces an analysis of the benefits versus the costs, okay? And allows you to make some judgments about what project it might be worth supporting versus another project where the agricultural sector may not get the biggest bang for the buck. And so it becomes important when you're talking about trying to sell this to John Q. Public out there in terms of, why do we want to do this project? It's going to cost X amount of dollars, and we're going to have to pay higher taxes. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there is a cost of doing nothing. There is a cost of not doing a project, okay? And in this particular instance, if you just look at personal time and reliability cost savings, in this case, you know, there's $2.63 million associated with savings doing this project, but that savings is foregone if the project is not done. So there's a lot of ways to turn this data to make arguments in terms of why a project ought to be done. So what we want to do here is let's change a couple of these values and show you how this works. And
you want to explain the project prioritization factor?
Yeah, go ahead, Brianne. You want to talk about the project prioritization factor?
Sure. So as David mentioned, you have a benefit cost ratio here for the whole project. It's the benefits versus the cost. And then below it, you see the total grain sector benefit. That's where we've split out the portion of the benefits that are only that are attributable to the grain sector. And then below that, there's a project prioritization factor, which is an estimate of the relative benefit to the grain sector per dollar spent on the project. So if this number is higher, it represents a higher benefit per dollar spent relative to the project with a lower factor. So this is where you can kind of compare multiple projects and see which one has a higher number for the grain sector. So as David mentioned, one of the things over here you can do is change the commodity mix. And so the commodity mix is already loaded in here for the particular state that you choose. It's just a statewide commodity mix. But if you know your region and you know that, you know, it's this where this project is going to be built, it's much more geared towards, you know, the grain sector, you can change these numbers as well. So let's say we went in here, let's say we changed this number, milled grain products, to this, and we take gravel and just zero it out because we know that in this region that's what's moving. And then you just hit calculate results, and you'll see over here our project prioritization factor went up a little. It was, I didn't look at it what it was before, but it was 4.1 something, I think, and now it's 4.6. You can see that this project would have a little more higher impact to the grain sector in particular.
Exactly, and I'm hypothesizing here, but I suspect it was zeroed out gravel, increased the amount of the percentage of grain, cereal grains, I think, is that what it was? Or excuse me, mill grain products. You think about it, gravel is not as time sensitive, and so that probably is one of the factors that helped drove that project prioritization factor up. So you're able to change the state up there, the type of the area where the project is done, the cost numbers, etc. And then, of course, the commodity mix changes based on the state, but then you can go in and make alterations for a local area that might be different than the state as a whole. The only thing you have to do is that when it comes to percentages is that they need to add up at the bottom to 100%. So if you change one by X amount, you need to decrease another one by the same amount, or in some way or another come up with so that the mix adds up to 100%. But that gives you a little idea. And by the way, this model, of course, is available online. And as I mentioned, there's a user's guide and a glossary, all that information up there, and it's available free of charge to use. And we'll show you the website at the end of the presentation. So that's a little analytical tool that you can use to help figure out what the impact of the relative impact of different transportation projects that may be proposed in your area on your particular business, and which one may have the biggest impact and to what extent. But ultimately, this comes down to a question of what does this mean to consumers? And I wanted to just to tell you a quick story about how we sort of got into this business to begin with, I've had to testify quite a few times in my life, and I was testifying before a committee, Texas House Committee on transportation finance. A couple of, well, I guess it was about 5 years ago now, and the chairman of the committee is a guy from West Texas, in San Angelo, Texas, to be precise. A gentleman that I've known for some time, and I thought, waxing eloquent about the importance of infrastructure investment to the economy. And I got through my testimony, and he said, David, he said, can you tell me what traffic congestion, how it impacts the price of a can of soup? And I said, Mr. Chairman, off the top of my head, I cannot. And we came back that day. He said, I want you to see if you can find out. And so with Max's help and Brianne's help and several others, we came back and we did those calculations. And that we learned a lesson from that, which is we can build a lot of these models, and that's all well and good, and they can help people doing analysis. But ultimately, what you need to do is you need to be able to translate that into something that makes a difference to the consumer. And that was something that was very important to the agricultural marketing service as well, as a part of USDA, was, how do we translate this into something that means something to consumers? And so we did that. One of the things that they asked us to do was to look at a market basket of food products and to figure out what kind of transportation costs were involved in these different types of products, and what was the cost of the delay associated with these products. And then ultimately, as a result of that, how much more were we paying than necessary? And when I say we, I mean all of us as consumers, for these products that we might not need to pay if we made better and more transportation investment decisions. And so we looked at this market basket of food products across these different categories, from meat and eggs and fish all the way to grains on the right-hand side. And we looked at those particular products you see listed below: chicken, beef, milk, sugar, oranges and apples, potatoes, tomatoes, flour. And we looked at transportation to different areas in the United States. And you see those there on the map. We just tried to pick 5 areas sort of scattered around the United States, and to figure out what those costs were. And it varied, obviously it varied on the distance that these things had to travel, as well as the mode, and then the delay that was involved in the movement of these products to the final end consumption there by the consumer. And so if we go to the next slide, you get an idea there of the base transportation cost per item for each one of these items, and the congested transportation cost per item. In other words, that part of that transportation cost that's due to traffic congestion, and then the cost associated with wait time of that in terms of moving that product, and then you get the total cost associated with that. And so you see that when you start looking at these different products, there can be some significant cost associated with moving these products from point A to point B due to traffic congestion and wait time. And whether you're talking about moving things, via truck or rail or barge in some cases. But there can be significant cost associated with that. And again, it's cost that ultimately all of us as end consumers end up paying. And it's a hidden cost that we really don't see or don't think about, on a day-to-day basis. You go in to pick up that can of, in this case, Campbell's tomato soup that we figured out, and turns out to be about 7.5 cents of that can of soup, at least down here in Texas, was due to traffic congestion. You add that doesn't sound like a lot in and of itself, but you add that up across all the different market goods that basket of goods that people buy during the course of a year, and it turns out to be a fairly considerable amount of money. And so you look at what they are in terms of a percentage, and you see anywhere from 2 or 3% up to 20% of a cost of a product is associated with transportation costs. So this becomes very, very important. And as I mentioned early on, it's the way we compete in the United States from a producer's perspective. It's the way we compete. Getting efficiency, whether you're talking about efficiency in your fields and producing products, or efficiency in transportation, efficiencies in manufacturing, whatever it is, that's how we compete. And being more efficient. And a lot of these transportation costs, the cost associated with delay, the cost associated with wait times, all of those things are due to, and many times, lack of investment in transportation infrastructure that then causes economic inefficiencies in the movement of those goods. And so that is one of the things that we need to remember in terms of the way we communicate these things. We need to put it in terms of that consumers can relate to, number one. And then number two, when we do some analysis, we need to use models like this, like the one we developed, to help analyze which type of transportation investment gives us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of the return to the agricultural sector. The links to the report are in this particular on this particular slide in terms of the reports themselves, and then the links to the web, the model itself. And again, you can go in there and change a lot of different aspects to this model, and I would encourage you to read the user's guide, but I would also encourage you to just go in there and play around with it. And that's where you can learn to use it and to share it with your state DOTs or other transportation officials. It's free to use. It'll be there on the web, and it's something that we will also try to keep updated as we move along, as these changes to our economy continue to occur. So with that, I'll be happy to, between myself and Brianne and Max, to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much for a great presentation, David and Brianne. We will now begin our Q&A session. If you have not yet submitted your questions, please do so at this time. Okay, our first question today. Why the big swings in total soybean transportation costs for all but domestic soybeans? And are most of the delay costs attributable to infrastructure-related disruptions in barge transportation?
Well, let me take a swing at those, and we'll ask Max and Brianne to chip in as well. The domestic soybeans is because that's more of a direct route. There's not very many options in terms of the transportation supply chain, if you will. It's more of a direct route, whereas some of these other products, when they're going from soybean into a meal or ultimately into an oil or whatever the case may be, they go through different stages, and those different stages have transportation costs associated with them, and so that can cause increased variability. It's important to remember, though, that 580 number, that is in and of itself an average. So it's not to say that it's always $5.80. It may be a little higher or lower. That in and of itself is an average. So there can be variability within that number because that number does represent an average. In terms of the second part of the question, particularly on barges, I mean, the lock system in the United States, there can be a significant amount of delay in terms of getting through a lock system associated with the wait time for these barges, which is a place that I don't need to tell you guys. We've had a long history of underinvestment in our lock and dam system along the Mississippi River and other major rivers as well. And so that is most of the delay there. Kendall, did I get all that question? I'm not sure.
Yes, you did. Okay, our next question. What are examples of wait time components? Are they private or public?
They can actually be both. And it varies. So wait time, so you have different components of wait time itself. So you have obviously driver time, vehicle operating cost, even things like that we don't really think about, fuel burn at idle versus fuel burn at 40 or 50 miles an hour. That fuel curve in terms of how much fuel is consumed, that efficiency is influenced by speed. So to the extent that speed begins to decrease, you get less efficient fuel burn, which drives up fuel costs. Everything from insurance costs, all those kind of costs are built upon a per mile cost, which is then converted into a cost per hour based upon the speed. So part of it can be when it's induced by congestion, that can be that's a cost that's caused by a lack of public investment most of the time, because you've got traffic congestion is basically more demand than we have supply, if you will, of infrastructure. That slows down speeds. So a lot of that is generated by public decisions that were made, but then there's also delay costs that can be caused by the private sector as well. Inefficiencies on the private side of the operation. I would say, however, that most of that delay cost is on the public side due to lack of infrastructure investment, because you, as a producer, have the incentive to make sure that you are squeezing every bit of efficiency out of the system that you can possibly get, and all of those things that you can control. But sometimes there may be things you can't control on the private side that causes inefficiencies and contributes to delay time. But an awful lot of it is on the public side, and that's what various governmental entities can control through proper infrastructure investment.
Okay, our next question. Have you had conversations with members of Congress on this study? And if so, what kind of reactions have you gotten?
Not specifically on this study, no. However, let me, as to the sort of the general notion of return on investment. I think this is David Ellis speaking here, and so don't mean to speak for TTI or AMS or USDA, but one of the things that I think, as a transportation side of things, we have done a remarkably poor job of over time, is making the argument about why these investments need to be made. And I alluded to this at the very beginning. Everybody focuses on what transportation improvements cost. What is it going to cost us? Are we going to have to raise motor fuels tax? Are we going to have to raise this tax or that tax or whatever the case is in order to pay for this? And we never ask the question, what does it cost not to do this? What is the cost associated with not making these investments? We have been very, very poor at communicating that side of the equation, so to speak, because there is a cost of doing nothing. We always assume that, well, if it costs us X, to say yes to this project, the cost of saying no must be zero because we don't have to raise anybody's taxes. Well, the fact of the matter is the cost is anything but zero because what we have over time is increased congestion cost, increased delay cost, which causes increased fuel costs and increased consumer costs, all of those things. We never talk about what the cost is of doing nothing and what the benefits are of addressing this problem. We have done a historically poor job of making that argument. I find my personal experience has been that when we do make that argument, we make some real headway because many times it's things that people have not thought about. They haven't thought about how it is we compete in this country with the rest of the world. They haven't thought about, okay, so when we let these highways or our lock and dam system deteriorate, it actually does make a difference to what people pay for a consumer good. It really does make a difference. They don't think about that. And like I say, we've done a poor job of it, but when we do make that case, people go, oh, okay, yeah, all right, that makes sense. Now, we're as a sector, as a transportation sector, we're out there competing with everybody else with transportation, with needs, if you will. But in our particular case, we can make a pretty strong argument about what the benefits are associated with the investment. And hopefully the tool that we developed along with others can help make that argument and can put some dollars behind some of the decisions and give people some ammunition to make those arguments.
Okay, our next question. What degree of the higher total transportation costs are attributable to the rates of the various modes and particularly escalating rail rates?
I'm not sure I can answer that question off the top of my head, to be honest about it.
Sure.
Ask that question one more time again, Kendall.
Sure.
I kind of lost track.
Sure. What degree of the higher total transportation costs are attributable to the rates of the various modes, particularly escalating rail rates?
Okay, I got it. So, so how much of the total cost, how much of that is attributable to higher truck costs versus higher rail costs versus higher barge costs? Is that, I think that's what the essence is. And I think that I'm going to have to dig inside the model to figure out, because it does allocate, there's an algorithm in there that allocates movement of goods across these three different modes. And I understand the question better now. I just don't have an answer for you.
So one thing I'd like to add to that is when you're in the model, we showed the truck transportation tab, but there is another tab in there that is multimodal, and you can put in information for each of the different modes, and it will calculate those transportation costs for each of them and then sum it all up for you.
Thank you. That is I'm glad can you go back to the model real quick? Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of different variables you have control over in this model. And what we showed you, got to move that window over. Yeah, we showed you just the truck model, okay? There's a multimodal model that allows you to split those things up by rail and by barge, so you can actually do that calculation. And if you set two of them to 0 and one of them to the whole value, it would give you a comparable cost of the three. But this model allows you to split the movement of the goods up by these different modes: barge, rail, and truck. And so, thank you, Brianne, for reminding me of that.
And I just wanted to add, if you go into the actual report, we have it broken down. You can at least see how much each of these goods is affected by truck, rail, and barge costs. So those goods there. And I think generally speaking, anything that's on trucks for longer is going to be more expensive, and then barge is least expensive. So those high cost ones are basically going long distances, and the more of that distance it's on truck, the higher cost it's going to be. But I don't think there's anything that accounts specifically for like increases in rail costs recently or anything like that.
Okay, our next question. What are some sources of delay for rail and trucking?
Well, rail can be mostly wait time, and that can occur at a terminal or at a yard, switching yard, etc. For trucks, it can also be wait time at a terminal, and then for trucks, it's also traffic congestion, and then at the offloading point, wherever it's at that particular terminal as well.
So, and one thing I want to point out too, we had, when calculating the congestion for trucks, we had that travel time index that we used. There was also a similar type of index that we applied to rail. It was just much smaller.
Okay, our next question. What are some examples of projects that the market model could be used on?
Sure. Gosh, you have, for example, right now, if everything from if you change a roadway, for example, from a 2-lane road to a 4-lane road, okay, that allows you more throughput, increased speeds, which reduces travel time. Things that you might not think about, things like overpasses that remove an intersection. That's a bottleneck, can have a significant impact. On the private side, if you look at putting in expansion of a terminal facility that cuts down on wait time, okay? So there's a lot of different things. I mean, we have used this on models similar to this from a benefit cost analysis basis for a lot of different transportation improvement projects. If you think about, time, increased time drives up costs. And then so you start thinking about whether it's an improvement in a lock system that's going to cut down wait time. All those barges have got operating costs per hour. And so to the extent that we can remove some of that delay time, then it increases the efficiency and has the effect of driving down cost. And so if you can make an improvement there in a lock system, if you can make an improvement at terminals, or if you go back to roadways, any number of different things. I mentioned, we're going to put in an alternate route that's going to cut down the time it takes to get from a farm area over to a terminal facility. We're going to cut it from a 60-minute trip down to a 50-minute trip or a 45-minute trip. That time ultimately makes a difference and drives down costs because it makes the movement of goods more efficient. So just about any kind of transportation improvement that changes speed or increases throughput can have a positive impact. Now, will it always come up to be, I say a positive impact, it will make a difference. Whether it will overcome the cost of the project, that's the kind of thing that an analysis will tell you. But it can have an impact on the plus side, and then it comes a question of, okay, which has the biggest input? But just about any project, to answer your question, that either reduces time or increases speed or allows more throughput will end up in some sort of a positive result depending upon the cost of the project itself.
Thank you. Our next question. Are cost coefficients for the models and activity, or sorry, excuse me, are cost coefficients for the modes and activities listed in the report?
Yes, they are. I'm flipping over through it real quick. Yeah, and then how we arrived at each one of those costs is also detailed in the report. If you look at the identifying transportation costs report, the first one on the screen, that's the one that lays out those cost components.
Thank you. Okay, next, do you have any significant success stories that you can share when the model has been used to convince local, state, or federal officials to pursue an infrastructure improvement project? And what was the process used to convince them and to make that happen?
Well, not with this particular model because we're just now rolling it out. However, this whole notion of communicating what you get for a particular transportation investment, we have had, and when I say we have had, I don't mean for TTI or us to take credit for this having occurred, but one of the things I think we did do was we changed the conversation here in Texas, where the state of Texas over the past 4 years has made about almost $5 billion in transportation investment more than they were scheduled to make. Because the argument came down to, we can't afford not to do this. We need to be more competitive in terms of the way we move people and goods. And it all came about because the conversation was changed, as I alluded to a moment ago, from what does it cost to also include what does it cost to do nothing. And this kind of analysis changed the nature of that conversation, or at least added a dimension to the conversation that had not been really included before. And so, yes, it caused policymakers in Texas to change the way they thought about it. But I think more importantly, it gave them tools to talk about why the state needed to make these kind of investments. And so, yes, it over the course of a longer period of time, last decade in Texas, this is something that has been evolving. But to begin to focus on that very question, what do you get for these kind of investments? And it all started more than 10 years ago now, actually, with a strategic economic transportation analysis that was done here led by TTI, and Tim Lomax, a colleague of mine, and I were the co-authors of that study. And it looked at how much do we need to invest in Texas in infrastructure over the next 25 years, and what do we get for it? That's the question that we were charged with answering, and that became the basis of a lot of subsequent decisions. And in order to invest in infrastructure, and as a part of that analysis, as a part of that report, we had to do this kind of analysis. And then we developed a whole series of models to help the state begin to look at those kind of things. And it's what needs to be done at the federal level as well.
Okay, thank you so much. That is all the time that we have for questions today. I want to go ahead and thank everyone for your participation. If your question was not answered on air today, it will be sent forward to our presenters. And that is all that we have for today's presentation. I want to thank NGFA and our presenters, David Ellis, Brianne Glover, and Max Steadman for joining us today. And I once again want to thank our sponsors, Central Life Sciences, CoBank, C-Tech Ag, Farm Credit Services of America, and Trinity Rail for their support in bringing you today's presentation. And as a reminder, today's webinar has been recorded and it will be available for viewing at grainnet.com within 24 hours. All registrants will also receive an email containing a link to the recording. I want to thank you all for attending, and I want to wish you all a great day.